Hi, good evening. I hope I am visible and audible. My name is Gayatri, and a very good evening to this session on the one of the nightmares of anatomy that we all have, including me. But having said that, I also get scared of this part of anatomy. But it's the basic, and it's the basis of anatomy. And for us physiotherapists, this is the bread and butter. I agree. There are various specializations of physiotherapy, but again, everything and anything should come back to head and neck, right? So just like the brain is the head office of our body, and head and neck anatomy is the most important part of anatomy and also of movement sciences. To tell you about myself, I am Gayatri, and I have done my master's in neurology and psychosomatic disorders, and I've been working as a neurophysiotherapist, sometime clinically, sometime academically, and now with Prakara. Okay. I hope I'm visible and audible, and let's see if we'll just wait for probably a couple of minutes, and I think I can start off with the session. It's not going to be a very subject-driven session. I am not going to teach you about the nuclei. I'm not going to teach you about the gray matter and white matter. Rather, I will only enable the thought process in you. So I hope I don't bore you. And I think I've put some decent enough makeup not to look too old. So let's get started in a couple of minutes. I'll just quickly grab some water and come. Okay, and get some coffee and sit, because head and neck, brain requires glucose. So make sure you have enough and adequate glucose next to you. Okay, I have water with me. See, as physios, we need to keep reading constantly for us to treat constantly. This goes universal for both students and for practitioners. When I was a student, the moment I passed out of my physiotherapy, I thought, physiotherapy is done. Now I am one of the top physiotherapists that who will earn. But when you start practicing, every day I would go back and read anatomy. Every day I had to go back and read physiology. I'd never imagined that just because I finished all my 4 years at one go, I need not read my textbooks again, is what my thought was. But then every day I would open anatomy, every day I would open abdomen anatomy, head and neck, every night I would read for an hour. Why would I read? Back then, I would be very underconfident, because I used to think, why am I not able to remember the nerve supply of why am I not able to remember the layers of scalp? Why am I not able to remember the lobes of cerebrum? The more I read, that's when some parts of head and neck remained ingrained in me. That's what happens with all of us, right? So when you keep reading a lot, that's when some parts of anatomy will remain with you for a lifetime. Is that necessary? Yes. It's enough? No, it's not. So head and neck anatomy, as complex as it sounds, can be broken down. And today I am more focusing on students, because since we cleared our anatomy exam as professionals, it's their turn now. And we, as their seniors and as their guides, should help them in enabling them to finish their exams with flying colors. I belong to Prakara, which is an organization which is striving for enhancement and development of the physiotherapy profession by all means. When I say all means, we have started with the enhancement of digital curriculum. And as a part of that, I work heading the Department of Physiotherapy here at Hyderabad. And thanks to this technology, I can get in touch with all the students across India now. Since it's time for us to start off with the session, I'll stop my bragging and then I'll quickly share my screen. I hope I already shared it. Forgive me if I make mistakes, because anatomy is always one big structure there. So it can lead me to small mistakes. But I wanted to start with frequently asked questions for the first years who are with us right now. So these are the frequently asked questions right from 2027 to 2022 across the South Indian states. all from the major universities. These are the major questions that I could think of, wherein these are the long answers. See, one good point about head and neck is that they are not asked every time as a long answer. So that way you can ease out a little. Just breathe in and breathe out twice. Yeah, that's what one of my friends tells. But you should remember what to write when asked and how much to write when asked. That is also very, very important. Okay. And make sure you pay attention to the length of the question and also the number of marks that it is awarded to. For example, say, as a part of long answer question, you have temporomandibular joint. And under that, there are types, articular surfaces, ligaments, movements, and applied anatomy. Before going into the techniques or technicalities of this, make sure that you will write applied anatomy for every question, even if not asked. Except for very short questions, because in very short answers in some exams, they directly ask applied anatomy only. They will straight away ask you what's Bell's palsy in a 2-mark question. But for a 5-mark or for a short answer, for a very long answer, even if they do not ask in the question, you have to write the applied anatomy. For example, in Pons, the question was only asked about gross anatomy, transverse section, and the level of facial colliculus. But you're supposed to and you're expected to write the applied anatomy. Okay, these are the questions. TMJ, facial nerves. See, among the cranial nerves, pay a little more attention towards facial nerve, considering that it is one of the important nerves for the face, along with the trigeminal nerve. You need to focus on the nuclei and the pathway of the facial nerve. You have the supranuclear pathway, you have the infranuclear pathway, and the intracranial and the extracranial pathway of the facial nerve. The nerve, when it starts and then till the stylomastoid foramen, once it exits the stylomastoid foramen, how does it branch into 5? This is what they expect you to write in the exam. And the course, branches, and the applied anatomy. Layers of scalp, very easy, not very difficult. But what they expect here is you to describe about each layer and the diagram. Please make sure that you draw relevant diagrams. And I'll give you the tips of writing these diagrams or drawing these diagrams effectively within 30 seconds. I'll tell you that later. These were some of the frequently asked short answer questions, again, in the last 5 years, because I thought it's good to have, questions which are from the last 5 years only and not very, very old ones. So some of the short answer questions are cavernous sinus, transverse section, nerve supply of tongue, extraocular muscles, fourth ventricle. TMJ has been asked as a short answer also. Circle of Willis, yes, one of the most important circle of Willis. Is one of the most important frequently asked 5-mark answer or an 8-mark answer in some exams. Muscles of mastication. Just the muscles of mastication are asked as your short answers. The medullary sections are asked. See, one best part about anatomy paper, boys and girls, is that if you just draw a diagram, it is enough. You need not write content for every question. It is okay to just draw a diagram, because the labeling that you do for the diagram and the kind of colors you use for the diagram is enough to give you more marks. And sometimes drawing a diagram gives you more marks than writing about it. For example, if you start writing about the transverse section of medulla, where are the transverse section happening? At this inferior colliculus, at the sensory level, at the pyramidal level, the pyramidal decussation, and then what are the nuclei that can be seen? Very, very long answer. But on the contrary, if you just draw a diagram, that is enough. Carotid triangle also. If you do not have time to explain what is a carotid triangle, what are the structures passing through the carotid triangle, just draw the diagram and mention the structures. It is enough. Internal capsule and corpus callosum. These are the only frequently asked short answer questions on the head and neck anatomy. This is my favorite slide because mnemonics are lifesavers, because there is so much to remember. There is extensive information in head and neck. How many will we remember? How many can one remember? branches of trigeminal nerve, layers of scalp, branches of facial nerve, branches of carotid artery. There are, and types of cranial nerves, what are the series of cranial nerves. There's so much to remember. Hence, these are the most commonly remembered mnemonics. I am not saying these are the only ones that you should remember, but these were told to me by my teachers, and hence these helped me pass my exam, and therefore I'm just continuing the legacy. Now, what is CMPM? Chief Minister, Prime Minister. Okay, so C is cerebral cortex, M is midbrain, P is pons, and M is medulla. In CMPM, the numbers that you're seeing below each alphabet are the names and numbers of the cranial nerves that arise from it. So the first and second cranial nerves arise from the cerebrum, cerebral cortex rather, midbrain, third and fourth cranial nerves, pons, 5, 6, 7, 8, and medulla, 9, 10, 11, 12. These are the cranial nerves, respective cranial nerves that come out of that particular structure of the brain and brain stem. If you cannot remember the exact, see, while studying, you're expected to study the name of the cranial nerve, the nuclei, where does it arise, how does it travel, what is its function. In the exam, it's not possible. This will help you. This will help you at least remember where is it originating. That's when you can mention the nuclei also. Foramen ovale, yes, this is one of the examples. There is foramen spinosum, there's foramen rotundum, there's foramen magnum. There are so many foramen, but one of the frequently asked viva question is foramen ovale, and the structures passing through it are mandibular nerve, accessory meningeal artery, lesser petrosal nerve, and emissary. So a male passes through the foramen ovale, right? Not just this, you must have read about lady between two majors, which is latissimus dorsi between teres major and pectoralis major. Correct. You have both the obliques going reverse, which is internal oblique and external oblique going in the reverse direction. That's how we were taught. We used to remember that. Similarly, one of the foramen is foramen ovale, and the structures passing through them will be these. So, because mnemonics are asked in the viva more than as a long answer, they're asked as very short questions and they're asked as viva questions. Yeah. Then comes scalp. Scalp, it's a very fancy, very most commonly used term by everybody, but scalp is actually a mnemonic for an expanded form, which is skin, connective tissue, aponeurosis, loose areolar tissue, and pericardium. Okay, so from superficial to deep, out to in, scalp is a layer from the skin to the periosteum or the cranium. These are some of the mnemonics that one should remember, and you can make your own also, because my friends would make their own fancy mnemonics by which they would remember somehow or the other, and they would write it in the exam. It all matters how you write it, and make sure you do not mismatch, don't put another structure in another mnemonic, but mnemonics are very, very important for anatomy. This is a very important slide. As a physiotherapy student, you must know what are the sections in the brain before even understanding how to study. Because in the exam, I'll ask you, explain about the coronal section of the brain, or explain about the oblique section of the brain, explain about the transverse section of the brain. You should be able to understand. The coronal section is a straight sagittal section. There's a straight vertical section. Okay, that's the slices that they do. When you slice it like that, that's the structural demarcation that you can see of the brain. Horizontal section is a transverse section. When you exactly cut the cerebral hemisphere into half like that, that's when you can notice. What are the structures you will notice? See, I'll not get into details because this is only about explaining you or familiarizing you with how to study, but I'll just quickly brush up. Okay, I'll just quickly go through. See, in the coronal section, you can properly see the cerebral hemispheres. You can see the commissural fibers. You can see a slicing of the midbrain. You can also see the slicing of the fourth ventricle. You can see the slicing of the internal capsule, right? You see the midline in the B diagram. That's the midline. In the C diagram, that's the cerebellum towards the end that you're seeing. In the transverse section, you can see the classic midline. You can also see the corpus callosum and the internal capsule and the commissural fibers and the gray matter and the white matter very, very, very clearly. You can notice the gray matter, which is gray in color, and the superficial white matter, which is very beautifully appreciated in a transverse section. Sagittal section is through the midline, the exact midline. You have two cerebral hemispheres like this. It's like separating these two cerebral hemispheres and just slicing it in the center. When you slice it in the sagittal section, that's when you can see all the structures in the sagittal section, because that is where you can appreciate one hemisphere of the brain completely. This will include the cerebral hemispheres, the gyri, sulci, very beautifully appreciated, the corpus callosum, the internal capsule, the mammillary bodies. Sometimes if you observe keenly, you can see the pituitary gland, the infundibulum, the stalk, and bringing it down to the midbrain, pons, and the medulla in the E picture. You can also notice the cerebellum too. Okay. Finally, the oblique section, you will be able to notice insular lobe. See, why do we ask for an oblique section? Usually oblique section is not asked in the exams, but when you start your practice or your clinical practice, your insular lobe is hidden by the frontal and the parietal lobes. I'll get there. So just to appreciate the insular lobe, to appreciate thalamus and the nuclei of the thalamus, they have to do an oblique section. Because only in the oblique section can you notice the thalamic nuclei and the hippocampus. That is why oblique section is needed. Therefore, remember these sections of the brain, because that's how even in the decussation or the dissection or even in the MRI, that's how they will be mentioning it. Now, this is one of the important diagrams when you are practicing, when you're studying. Make sure that you study the brainstem with relation to the nuclei, because in the exam, they'll ask you about the nuclei. Explain which cranial nerve nuclei exit or arises from which part of the brainstem. Okay, so you have your midbrain, pons, and medulla. It's like this. You have midbrain, pons, and medulla like that. Medulla continues as your spinal cord. Medulla oblongata continues as a spinal cord. You have in the midbrain, it's easy to remember in this picture. In the midbrain, the nuclei arising at the superior colliculus will be oculomotor nucleus, and the inferior colliculus will be your trochlear nucleus. Along with the cranial nerves, what are the extra nuclei present? Those are also you're supposed to write. So what you can do is, one of the tip that many good students follow is they make a 3-column table with midbrain, pons, and medulla. And what they do is they'll mention the nuclei. Which nuclei arise? Cranial nerve nuclei. What kind of nuclei arise from the midbrain, pons, medulla? The extra nuclei, like the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. What are the extra nuclei that arise from each of the part of brainstem are also compared in a 3-column sheet. You can do that also. Since I couldn't draw and write all that, this picture was self-explanatory. Then you come to the pons. See, till here is the midbrain, correct? Then you can come to pons. Upper pons, you have the trigeminal motor nucleus of trigeminal nerve, while in the lower pons, you have the facial nucleus. Other than that, you also have abducent nucleus and from the pons, correct? And you will also have the lacrimatory nuclei. You can notice that the lacrimatory nuclei are also there. And along with that, you have the vestibular and the ventral cochlear and dorsal cochlear nuclei, which are responsible for hearing and vestibular apparatus. So your balance and equilibrium is also partly guided by the pons and cerebellum. Cerebellum takes care of your equilibrium, I agree. But there are nuclei in the pons that are also responsible. Why am I telling about nuclei? Because I'll again correlate with the clinical anatomy. I'll get there. But for now, you'll have to understand that the upper pons and lower pons give rise to the respective cranial nerve and also the lacrimatory nuclei. You also have the salivatory nuclei, which are responsible for the salivary glands like your parotid, submandibular, sublingual glands, salivary glands. Their nuclei are also situated in the pons. Another quick practical tip for you, pons also is a very, very important vomiting center and a respiratory center. You have apneustic and pneumotaxic centers and dorsal and ventral respiratory centers. So your respiration is controlled by pons. Okay. And then come down to the medulla. Pons continues as medulla. Medulla will give rise to the hypoglossus nucleus, vagus nucleus, trigeminal nucleus also arises from between the pons and the medulla, and you also have nucleus of solitary tract. Apart from that, you have the visceral afferent pathway, general visceral afferent, general visceral efferent, somatic visceral afferent, somatic sensory efferent. These are the nuclei that are being carried in and out from the brainstem to the respective organ or to the respective sensory part. Therefore, you for now remember the nuclei and what are the cranial nerves arising from it, what are the other extra nuclei arising from it, and that will summarize the brainstem part. If I have to talk about applied anatomy, here, one good part is when you read about a nucleus, you will also read about the function of it, correct? When you are highlighting one part, it is understood that damage to that part leads to a defect in the function of that nucleus. Therefore, when you, for example, say if you are highlighting, say, facial nucleus at the lower pons, you can highlight it in the diagram itself, mention its applied anatomy right next to it. Applied anatomy, damage to the facial nerve, the nucleus leads to facial palsy. Because it's an upper motor neuron lesion, because it is happening at the nuclear level only. For example, if you are mentioning at the trochlear nucleus, when you mention at the trochlear nucleus, you will mention highlighted applied anatomy, vision is affected, because trochlear nerve is responsible for vision, correct? And the extraocular muscles of the eyeball. Similarly, with the abducent nucleus also. You highlight the abducent nucleus, applied anatomy, extraocular muscles of the eye are affected. That gives extra marks for you, because you know the function of the cranial nerve. All you have to do is just highlight that in a light color so that the examiner can understand that you've drawn the nucleus. You've also highlighted the part. It's like a hazy portion. And then you've mentioned the applied anatomy. If you cannot write it in the paragraph, draw and label and write then and there, it is understood. Okay? So that's how you can create an applied anatomy in the diagram itself, because you will know the function of the individual cranial nerve, not just cranial nerve. See, vestibular nuclei are also there. Highlight the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei. When you highlight that, it is understood that the cochlea is damaged, correct? So there will be a central hearing issue or central vestibular disorder if the vestibular nuclei are affected. That's how the examiner will know that you are also reading applied anatomy, and that will give you more marks. Another important diagram that one has to remember is the decussections. The medulla decussections, this is at the level of the fourth ventricle. Now, you know what is a fourth ventricle, no? It is a space between the pons and the medulla, which is in front of the cerebellum. The cerebellum lies complete posterior. Now here also, this is at the olivary nucleus, the level of olivary nucleus passing through the floor of fourth ventricle. This is through the floor of fourth. See, that's the fourth ventricle that you can see, the dorsal portion that you can see, because fourth ventricle, and then this is the medulla. So through that, if you're cutting it, that's when if this is your fourth ventricle, this will be the medulla. Okay. So if I have to cut like that, that's when I will notice the transverse decussation of the medulla. Here also, what you can do is highlight the portion of the vagus nerve, because vagus nerve is one of the most important nerves in the human body, one of the most important cranial nerves in the human body that handles almost every part of the human body. And any mild lesion at the vagus nerve can affect almost all the primary functions. You can mention that. So highlight the cerebellar tract, otherwise spinocerebellar tract, highlight the tectospinal tract, you highlight the hypoglossus nucleus. It all depends on if you know the function of it and what happens if that gets affected. Again, it's not necessary for you to mention all the labels. Pick up important ones. Pick up hypoglossal nerve, pick up the cranial nerves in that diagram, pick up the tracts in the diagram, because tracts are very, very important because they cross from the spinal cord and they cross over the medulla and then they go. Because tracts connect brain and the spinal cord. Therefore, it is very important to mention the tracts. And tracts decussate at the medulla. Some tracts do not, some cross over. And that is why it is extremely important for us to mention the spinocerebellar tracts, the tectospinal tract. You have the medial longitudinal bundle. You have the peduncles. Sometimes you might have to also mention the cerebellar peduncles also. But even if you forget that, please do not forget about the lateral spinothalamic tract, because that is most important, because that's what crosses from the medulla and it goes up. Okay. This is about the medullary decussation. Another important part in the medulla that they can ask you is only applied anatomy of medulla only. And this diagram helps in understanding where is a lesion and what happens. So number one that you're seeing, it's the central portion of the medulla, just below the fourth ventricle. If you are seeing, if I have to compare the previous picture, your hypoglossal nerve and the arcuate nucleus, you can see this, exactly this portion where you have the tectospinal tract, the hypoglossal nucleus and the arcuate nucleus. If they get affected, that is what, and that's the cylindrical portion that you're seeing is a medial lemniscus. And if that gets affected, it leads to a medial medullary syndrome, wherein if the other portion, the lateral portion of the medulla gets affected, it's the lateral medullary syndrome. It is okay if you cannot write what are the symptoms of medial medullary syndrome. It is still okay if you cannot mention the function, but make sure that you highlight and then you mention the applied anatomy just like that. Because with time constraint, you cannot write in paragraphs. Draw a diagram, put a label there, applied anatomy, and what is the name of the condition that can affect. Okay. When I was talking about fourth ventricle, I found it difficult to explain it to you in the air. Where does it lie? So you can see that this is the pons. First, appreciate the major structures. Then can you appreciate the fourth ventricle? Because fourth ventricle is not a structure, but it's a space. I'm again repeating it. Fourth ventricle is only a gap. Okay. Just like your lateral ventricle, your third ventricle, it's a space between the pons and the medulla in front of the cerebellum. You can see the tree-like structure, the arbovitae that you can see of the cerebellum, and that's the vermis of the cerebellum. The median dorsal recess of the fourth ventricle is what you can notice here, correct? And that lies between the pons and the medulla. So if this is the transverse section of the medulla, that's when there'll be a floor of fourth ventricle that you have seen till now. This diagram is important. Make sure that you remember this diagram, and because diagram of fourth ventricle is frequently asked, therefore if you draw anything near to it, should be okay. This is another most important part while preparing for head and neck, is that you are supposed to know what are the lobes of cerebrum and what are the gyri and the sulci of the cerebrum. The cerebral cortex is known for its invaginations, like the twists and turns that the cerebrum has. It is known for it. And thanks to our seniors who have worked so much on research, every gyri and every sulci are named. But is it easy? It's not easy to remember all of that, but we can still try our best. The top portion that you're seeing is the MRI, and in the MRI, you can notice that the front lobe or front part of the lobe that is just above the eyeball is your frontal lobe. Behind that will be the parietal lobe. Towards posterior, it continues as occipital lobe. And just behind the eye will be the temporal lobe, just at the, just above the ear. And in front, that is the anterosuperior portion of the ear, and just behind the eyeball superiorly will be your temporal lobe. When you slice it obliquely is when you see the insular lobe. Insular lobe, which is more important for olfaction, and that is covered by the frontal front and the parietal laterally. And the below figure explains about the gyri of the cerebral cortex. And these are the major gyri. You have the precentral gyrus, the postcentral gyrus, superior frontal, middle frontal, inferior frontal. These are the major names of the gyri one is expected to remember. How do you remember? Draw the lobes first. It's easy to draw the lobes of the cerebrum because this diagram helps us in drawing it very easily. I wish I could draw right now, but then I'm not a very good artist. And thanks. Fortunately, you're saved from seeing my drawing, but you can always practice drawing like this. You need not be an artist. I'm telling you again, no examiner expects you to be an artist. You need not draw the MRI of the brain. Make sure you just draw the lobes of cerebrum and draw gyri anyhow, but remember to label the exact gyri. You cannot label the superfrontal as precentral. Precentral, postcentral, superfrontal, middle frontal, inferior frontal. See, frontal is easy, superior, middle, and inferior. You have the precentral, and this is the central cortex, right? The motor cortex. Then you have the postcentral gyrus. Then the superior parietal lobe, that's the parietal lobule. The lobule is a part of a lobe, correct? Then you have the supramarginal gyrus. And then since this is the angle, I can say it goes towards the occipital lobe. It's the angular gyrus because it is between the temporal and the occipital. Temporal is again easy. Superior temporal, middle temporal, inferior temporal gyri. Okay. Lobes of cerebrum, please make sure that you draw and you keep practicing. How can you quickly draw the lobes of cerebrum? And also when practicing the lobes, just briefly understand what are the functions of each lobe of cerebrum. What does frontal lobe do? What does parietal lobe do? At least 4 functions. There are multiple functions each lobe does. I don't expect as a first year student to remember every detail of it. At least 3 functions of each lobe is mandatory because that will give you extra marks. Even if not asked, if you mention, you'll be the smart student of the class. This is what I was talking about. See, in the frontal lobe, what are the functions and what happens if it gets affected? Because lobes of cerebrum is also asked as a frequently asked question. Make sure that when you are writing, you write it like this. Make a 3 column. It is okay if you're in your exam, if you're writing it horizontally, you're supposed to write it like this. It's okay if you write it like this for answers. Examiners do not mind, but the content should be there. I'm not going to get into details. Make sure that for the lobes, you write not all the functions. For example, for frontal lobe, just write personality, emotional control, social behavior, because that's what frontal lobe does. And any damage to it causes lack of initiation, antisocial behavior, lack of inhibitions. They do not have a good and bad discrimination in them. They just talk whatever they want to if the frontal lobe gets affected. Parietal lobe, dominant or not dominant, it's okay. Just mention parietal lobe. The functions are spatial orientation. So your parietal lobe is very, very important for you to stand in space. For example, when you're walking, when you're taking a turn, when you're sitting, when you're standing, when you're getting inside a bus, when you're getting inside a metro, you're coming out. The orientation of the human body in the space around you is taken care by the parietal lobe. Not just that, your parietal lobe is also responsible for recognition of the faces, recognition of certain figures, numbers, appreciation of music, calculation, language, logical reasoning, analysis, and analyzing and thinking. All this is done by the parietal lobe. Therefore, people who have road traffic accident history, or people who have history of cerebrovascular accidents, otherwise called strokes, if the parietal lobe is affected, they end up having calculation issues. They end up having issues in recognizing people. Okay, and they also end up in having agnosias. There are multiple agnosias. You have somatognosia, prosopagnosia, finger agnosia, left and right agnosia. So they cannot recognize faces quickly. They cannot recognize left and right quickly. They cannot recognize smell. They cannot recognize music. All this recognition is taken care by the parietal lobe. Not just that, the learning how to write, learning how to tie shoelaces, learning how to stitch. Now, all this intricate learning is also done by parietal lobe. Temporal lobe, standard function is auditory function. Along with that, verbal and non-verbal communication and language is also taken care by the temporal lobe. But one of the most important function after hearing is smell. Temporal lobe also takes care of smell. So any impaired smell sensation, any verbal sensation, verbal impairments, that's why there's written aphasia. Aphasia is where there is problem in speech. There'll be receptive sensory aphasia, motor aphasia, global aphasia, and any smell sensation, balance sensation affected, temporal lobe needs to be checked. Finally, occipital lobe is completely responsible for vision. The Brodmann's areas 19, 20, 21 are present in the occipital lobe, which are visual processing, visual association areas, and any damage to the occipital lobe can cause visual agnosia, as simple as visual agnosia to a complete nasolotemporal blindness also. Therefore, this table should be remembered in terms of lobes, functions, and their damage. Quickly, I will brief up on the ascending and the descending tracts, because these are one of my most, tremor-giving topics. Ascending and descending tracts are very, very difficult to remember. Look at the table, look at the columns, look at the rows, look at the alphabets. That itself gives me fits. But all I can tell you is pick up where are they originating and pick up what are their functions, and then you can segregate it and you can write. It is okay if you cannot write the origin, but make sure you write the location and the function importantly. For example, your lateral corticospinal tract and the rubrospinal tract and the lateral reticulospinal tract are arising from the lateral white column of the spinal cord. One thing that you have to remember is ascending tracts always start at the they go from the spinal cord and then they from the cortex and they terminate into the spinal cord. Okay, so these are the sensory tracts and they originate in the primary cord, usually in the primary cortex only, or the motor cortex, but some like your rubrospinal tract and your vestibular tract, they arise in the midbrain. Rubrospinal arises from the red nucleus, rubro red. That's how you remember. Tectospinal tract from the superior colliculus of the midbrain, and the medial reticulospinal from the reticular formation, which is in the medulla. Medulla has that, in the diagram also you will see a net kind of a formation. It's called a reticular formation. Originating is from either the motor cortex or midbrain or the medulla. Easy. And then they terminate into the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. It is standard that all of them are ending or terminating in the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. Which lamina? It is okay. No one will ask you in detail. Is it lamina 4? Is it lamina 6? It's okay. You can stop at the AHC or just at the spinal cord. Also, just mention brief function. No need to write at length. But make sure that the corticospinal tracts, the anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts are very, very important for conscious movements of the muscles. The muscles of the voluntary muscles and skeletal muscles are controlled by the lateral corticospinal tract because that crosses. The anterior corticospinal tract does not cross. It's an uncrossed pyramidal tract. That's why it's written uncrossed. It goes just like that. But the lateral corticospinal tract, it crosses and decussates, and then it is responsible for the conscious movements. Rubrospinal tract is responsible for the muscle tone, which is unconsciously controlled, unlike your lateral corticospinal tract. And even the vestibular spinal also should be unconscious. Your vestibular apparatus, your balance can't be conscious. It is all under involuntary control of your body. Tectospinal controls the head and neck movements. When I say head and neck movements, head on body, neck on body, sudden pivoting, sudden twisting and turning movements of the body, alignment of the head, neck, and arms in response to the visual stimuli. All this is taken care by the tectospinal tract. Lateral reticulospinal tract responsible for the skeletal muscle, the motor neurons of the skeletal muscle. And finally, the medial reticulospinal tract is responsible for the inhibitory influence. The lateral reticulospinal tract causes a facilitatory influence, while the medial calms it down. It has a calming down or an inhibitory influence on the motor neurons of the skeletal muscles. Again, these work in relation with the lateral corticospinal tract. Not to confuse you, just remember the tract, remember the location or the origin, from where they originate, where do they terminate, and what are their functions. Similarly with the descending tracts. Your descending tracts are also the rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, tectospinal, and the medial longitudinal fasciculus. These ascending and descending tracts are very, very important in terms of their functions. More than anatomy, they are asked usually in physiology, but in anatomy, you are expected to know the ascending tracts more than the descending tracts. Finally, easiest slide and not much time taking. When you are drawing a diagram, you have to make sure that you will draw the structure in that particular color only. God has given us so many colors, so why not use it and get more marks? Artery is supposed to be in red, vein is supposed to be in navy blue or dark blue, not sky blue. Muscle, sky blue for lymphatic system. Sky blue you're supposed to draw if it's a lymphatic drainage, for lymph nodes, for if they ask about explain the lymphatic drainage or lymphatic system in the lower limb or in the upper limb, explain axillary lymph nodes, explain inguinal lymph nodes, that's when you will draw the lymph nodes in sky blue. Otherwise, dark blue is for vein. Maroon, brown is for muscle. Muscles are always in brown. Ligaments and tendons are in dark green. Okay. Nerve is always yellow. Always nerves are yellow. Organs are maroon. Do not get confused between a muscle and an organ. Organ should be in maroon and muscle should be in brown. And bone, finally, since it's the skeleton, you cannot draw in white. What will you see if you draw in white? You're supposed to draw it in black, because around the bone can you weave the soft tissue structures. Therefore, since it's a skeleton, it can be drawn with black. The other colors, you have to make sure that you will use these specific colors, because the kind of color you use also will give you extra marks. Okay, remember this while preparing. Finally, what we do in terms of enhancing your curriculum is the enhancement of curriculum is by the mini learning program that we have started, and this will include all the lectures or video lectures, notes and key terms for all the major subjects of the first year of Bachelor's of Physiotherapy. We have made sure that the quality is not compromised, but at the same time, the understanding has made a little more easy and simple. So do join us, because it's very affordable and economical for all the students across the country, and join us and be a part of our learning journey. And I hope this has helped in making your preparation simple. I'm open for questions, and I hope I didn't bore you. I had to be very crisp and precise. Forgive me if I made any mistakes. I'll go back and read and I'll correct. But I'm always open. My team is always open for questions. And for anything, we're always there. All the very best.